Welcome to Apply IT. In this video, I am going to demonstrate behavior of race method of promise class that is available in JavaScript. There are many static methods in promise class, and Promise.race is one of the methods related to concurrency. So in this video, we will understand behavior of Promise.race method practically. If you are new and not aware, this is the 11th video in the series on JavaScript promises, where we try to understand advanced JavaScript concepts practically. If you haven't watched our previous videos, then do watch them and then come back to this video for better understanding. You can find links for those videos in the video description. So let's jump into today's topic, understanding behavior of Promise.race method practically. So first, let's understand the problem that we are going to solve. Consider we have weather API whose implementation is available at two places. The first implementation is available through getWeatherFast API function, and the second implementation is available through getWeatherSlow API function. Now, what's the difference between these two APIs? So both these APIs are identical in response data, but they take different amount of time in generating the response. Whenever we are going to see this practically, we'll simulate that this fast API is generating response fast as compared to this slow API. So let's understand how to simulate this getWeatherFast API. So this getWeatherFast function is returning a fulfilled or resolved promise after 3 seconds. And here in response, we write that getWeatherFast, then colon, weather is windy today. So this is the response that is generated by this getWeatherFast API function. In the same way, we simulate the second function, that is getWeatherSlow API function. So this also returns a fulfilled or resolved promise, but it takes 4 seconds in generating the response. Now, because we want to get data from any of these two APIs, we use a function called Promise.any, to which we can pass these two promises as input. So we create our wrapper function called getWeatherData, and within this function we call Promise.any method, and we pass getWeatherFast and getWeatherSlow as two promises as input. Now earlier we learned the behavior of Promise.any. This Promise.any method focuses on the very first promise that is getting fulfilled. So for example, the first promise, say it's getting rejected, then it will see the second promise. If second promise gets fulfilled, then it's going to return response from that second promise, which is the first fulfilled promise. So we can use Promise.any in this case. So why we are using Promise.any? So we try to understand the difference between use of Promise.any versus Promise.race. So for that purpose, here first we try to understand behavior of Promise.any, and then we are going to compare behavior of Promise.any with that of Promise.race. So next we use Promise.race. So we simply replace any word by the race word, and the rest of the code is essentially same. So let's understand this practically. So let's go to Google Chrome and try to understand this practically. So we go to Google Chrome, we open Developers Tools, we go to Console, and here we are going to write our code. So first we write getWeatherFast API function, which is simulating successful API, which takes 3 seconds in generating response. Then we write getWeatherSlow API function, which takes 4 seconds in generating successful response. Now we write our wrapper function called getWeatherData, and in this function we are going to measure how much time this function will take using this console.time and console.timeEnd. So let's write this function. Now we are going to call this wrapper function. So I'm going to hit enter key. Observe that how much time this function is taking in generating the response. So initially promise will be pending, and after approximately 3 seconds we are getting a response, and the response is successful API call. and we are getting response from this get weather fast API function. Now we rewrite our wrapper function again, but now instead of Promise.any, we use Promise.race method. So let's enter it. Now I'm going to make call to that wrapper function. So again, I'm going to hit enter key. You observe that after how much time we are getting response. So initially promise will be pending. After approximately 3 seconds, we are getting response. And here also response is successful API response. We get response from this fast API function. In this case, we observe that both Promise.any and Promise.race are behaving exactly same. Now we are considering next situation where we are making our faster API to fail. So to simulate that, we are returning a rejected promise after 3 seconds from this getWeatherFast API function. And then again, we observe behavior of Promise.any and Promise.race. And we'll observe that what behavior we are getting in this situation. So let's understand this practically. So let's go to Google Chrome and try to understand it. So I'm rewriting my getWeatherFast API function. Instead of resolved promise, we are returning a rejected promise, and it gets rejected after 3 seconds. Now I'm using my getWeatherData, which is my wrapper function, to use of Promise.any. So let's enter it. And now we're going to call that wrapper function. So observe its behavior. I'm hitting enter key. Initially promise will be pending. And after approximately 4 seconds, we are getting response from this getWeatherSlow API function. So here we observe that in case of Promise.any method, the first API function is returning a rejected promise. Then Promise.any is waiting for the response from the second promise or the second API call, which is returning a resolved promise or fulfilled promise. So which takes 4 seconds. So that's why the focus of Promise.any method is on resolved or fulfilled promise. So this is the behavior of Promise.any in this situation. Now let's rewrite our getWeatherData wrapper function to use Promise.race method. So we have done one change here. Instead of Promise.any, we are using Promise.race method. So let's enter this function. And now we are going to call that wrapper function. So here you observe that what behavior we are getting in this situation. So I'm going to hit enter key and observe the response. Initially promise will be pending, and after approximately 3 seconds we are getting error response. So here we observe that the first API is returning a rejected promise after 3 seconds. So Promise.race is returning that response. That is, weather data is not available, and that response we are getting from getWeatherFast API function, which is the first promise. And it took approximately 3 seconds in generating the response. So this is very important. We observe that in case of Promise.any, it was focusing on the successful response or the fulfilled promise, whereas Promise.race is focusing on the very first promise that is getting settled. So this we'll understand Promise.race is focusing on settled, not on fulfilled promise. So we might think that then what is the use of this race method? So let's add more information to our existing situation. Our getWeatherFast API function, which provides response in a fixed time. Whatever time it takes is fixed. Whereas the other API implementation, that is getWeatherSlow API function, so sometimes this response time is very large. Behavior of this getWeatherSlow API function is not predictable. Sometimes it generates response very quick, and sometimes it may generate response with large response time. So we assume that this getWeatherFast is a costly API in terms of monetary cost, and getWeatherSlow API is a cheap or say free API, and Our preference is that we want to use free API first. If it is not working, then only we go for the second API, that is get weather fast API, because the get weather fast API is very costly API. So we do not want to call this costly API every time. So we first try to get a response from this slow API. If it is fine, we provide that response to the user. If it is failing, then only we go to call to the fast API. So this is what we are going to do. We are going to call first get weather slow, but get weather slow API function generates response with unpredictable response time. We are going to call this get weather slow API with some timeout. So within that specified timeout, we are getting a response. It is fine. Otherwise, we want to generate some error message. And we are going to call this get weather fast API function only when the first API is not successful. So let's create a timer as a promise. So we create another function called get timeout, which returns a rejected promise after 3 seconds. It's not performing any logic. It's very simple. This get timeout function is returning a rejected promise after 3 seconds. So how we are going to use it? So let's understand it. So assume that we want to get a response in say 6 seconds. This is a hypothetical scenario just to understand the behavior. In real world, it won't take say in terms of seconds, it will be in terms of milliseconds. But just to understand, assume that we want to get a response of this weather data in 6 seconds. So first we are going to make call to this get weather slow API function, but with timeout of 3 seconds. If we get response, it is fine. We'll send that response to the user interface. If you're not getting a response, then we are going to call the second API function, that is get weather fast. And because this is predictable, it is generating response in say within 3 seconds. The total time will be taken is approximately 6 seconds. We are considering this situation to understand behavior of Promise.race method and use of Promise.race method. So basically what we are going to do is we are going to have a race between our timer promise and our slow API promise. We modify our get weather data wrapper function. We use here Promise.race. As a first promise, we pass promise that is written by get weather slow API function. Second promise is a timer promise that is written by this get timeout API function. So what is this promise.race? So promise.race is a static method which takes an iterable of promises as input, and the method returns a single promise. And that return promise gets settled when any one of these input promises gets settled. And in our previous video about promise.all settled, we understood in detail what is the meaning of a settled promise. So in brief, I tell you the meaning of settled promise is that promise is either fulfilled or rejected, but it is not pending. So promise.race method is focusing on very first promise that is getting settled. Now that promise could be rejected or resolved, doesn't matter. Meaning of settled is it is either fulfilled or rejected. So that's why in the second scenario, we observed that Promise.any method was returning a response after 4 seconds from the second API, whereas in case of Promise.race method, it was returning a rejected promise, the response from the rejected promise, because Promise.race focuses on very first settled promise. So let's understand this practically. So let's go to Google Chrome and try to understand it. So I'm writing this get timeout function, which returns a promise after 3 seconds. That promise is a rejected promise with a message as timer expired. We are rewriting our get weather data function, which is a wrapper function, which is making call to promise.race. And here we pass get weather slow and get timeout function, which return promises. We pass these two promises as input. Now we are going to make call to that wrapper function. So I'm going to hit enter key, observe the behavior in this situation. What behavior we are getting? Just to remind you, this getWhetherSlow API function is generating response, that is successful response after 4 seconds, whereas getTimeout function is returning a rejected promise after 3 seconds. So I'm going to hit enter key, just observe the behavior. So initially promise will be pending, and after approximately 3 seconds we are getting a response, but here we get response as error from this second promise, which is returning a rejected promise. So here in this situation, when we get any error, say we are getting error after 3 seconds, so at that point now we can try to make call to that costly API, which is a paid API. So we call to that paid API only in the situation when our slow API is failing. So in this case, we cannot make call to this slow API directly, because if we do that, we have to wait for longer period, because we don't know that how much time it is going to take. So instead of that, what we want to do is we want to wait for some fixed period. Within that period, if we are getting response, it is fine. If you are not getting response, we do not rely on response of that API, that is slow API. We switch to our fast API. So in this situation, we use Promise.race method. So let's compare behavior of Promise.any with Promise.race. So earlier we learned behavior of Promise.any. So we consider two situations. In one situation, any one promise is getting resolved. So whenever very first promise gets resolved, we get response from that promise. And in the second situation where all the promises get rejected, we come to know about the response after all these three promises have written the rejected promise. So we return here that response from the first rejected promise, but that we can do only after all these three promises get evaluated. Now let's understand behavior of Promise.race method. So again, we consider two situations where all input promises are fulfilled, and in second case, any one promise is getting rejected. So when all promises are getting fulfilled, we get a response from the first promise that is getting fulfilled. So consider that the first promise is taking 3 seconds, second promise is getting 4 seconds, and the third promise is taking 5 seconds. So first promise is this one, which is taking 3 seconds in fulfilling. So we get response after 3 seconds. Whereas in the second case, the first promise is taking say 3 seconds for generating a rejected promise, and all others are generating successful promise or say fulfilled promise. So once this promise gets rejected, immediately we get a response. So we observe that the Promise.race method is focusing on a settled promise, not on fulfilled promise. Whichever promise gets settled first, we get response from that promise. This is the first promise that is getting fulfilled, so we get response from that. And in this case, this is the first promise that gets rejected, we get response from that. And this is what exactly we observed along with the use of timer promise. So that timer promise was taking 3 seconds, whereas the second API function, which was generating a resolved promise after 4 seconds. So in that situation, we are getting response once the timer gets expired. So once the timer gets expired, we get rejected promise from that. So that is the behavior of Promise.race method. If you put them side by side, it will be like this. So you can easily observe that what is the difference between Promise.any and Promise.race. So Promise.any is focusing on first successful promise that we can see here, whereas Promise.race method is focusing on very first settled promise. You can see here the Promise.race is focusing on very first settled promise. So to summarize, with Promise.any, if any one API succeeds, then the result will be successful, and the response from all other API calls, that is promises, will be discarded. If all API fails, like in this situation, then only result will be failure in case of Promise.any. However, with Promise.race, if any one API is settled, so meaning of settled is either resolved or rejected, then all other API calls or promises will be discarded, and the final result will be the first settled promise. That is the response from the first settled promise. So that is the behavior of Promise.race. If you like this video, then give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comment section how this video was useful to you. If you have not subscribed this channel, then do subscribe it and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching and happy learning. We'll see you in the next video.